So the Andy Warhol Foundation selected Stanford to be the home of Warhol's contact sheets. Immediately, we have a kind of Borgesian problem because the acquisition is 3,600 discrete sheets on which there are approximately 36 images, bringing us to a total of 130,000 discrete images. This is Warhol in a very exuberant performance of the act of taking a photograph. And of course, his photograph is being taken. And the mutuality, or what we might call the double gesture, of taking a photograph and being taken by the camera is something that we want to explore as we begin to think about how we can address this archive. So he used a series of actual cameras, but the contact sheets, almost all of them, were taken with the Minox. Again, though, what interests me about this particular image is that the center of attention is actually the camera. And one of the things that Warhol said very famously is, "I want to be a machine." And I think that we can see in this image a kind of phantasmatic image of the adjoining of the human and the machine, which I think was one of the cores of Warhol's overall project. Okay, so when we first decided to work on this project, Richard, who is, trained as an art historian, just said, "There's no way we're going to show these contact sheets. They're so boring." And I said, no, they're absolutely fantastic. And I come from performance studies, so for people with my training, they represent a kind of displacement of the usual way that we talk about the art object. So I was extremely excited, and I was like running down the idea that nobody would want to look at all of these images because I wanted to look at them all. Part of what I could see right from the beginning was this notion that the gift itself was an illumination of the institutional practices of the Andy Warhol Foundation, the Cantor Museum, and Stanford University. And I thought we needed to be very explicit about that. So another way to put it is, what was in it for each of the institutions, and how would we not try to hide that, but rather bring it into the light? So why Stanford? And on a kind of jokey level, the cardinal is red and white, and Warhol's most iconic image, the Campbell soup can, is red and white. So we have that as a kind of joke. But then more seriously, as many of you probably know, Muybridge and Leland Stanford Sr. had a bet about whether or not the horse lifted all four of its hooves when it ran. And in many ways, this experimental research that they did was the kind of founding gesture of the university. So what Muybridge is a really curious figure in the history of Stanford and in the history of art, because he combines science and aesthetics in a really interesting way. And so what I started to try to develop in thinking about this gift was the idea that Warhol is kind of, ironically, in the tradition of Muybridge, which is not what you would immediately think when you think about Warhol. But the sheer accretion of these contact sheets are an instance of what Stanford likes to call big data. And very rarely do people at Stanford think of art itself as an occasion of big data. But I think Warhol allows us a really interesting conversation about that. The other thing that we can begin to do is think about how this artistic practice of the contact sheets also sheds light on his other activities, including the time capsules, which was, again, this kind of performance in which he would clean his desk by putting a big box next to it and putting everything in it, taping it up, and sending it to New Jersey, which I think sometimes when I see my desk, I think, oh, I could make a time capsule too. But in the time capsules, there are many, many unopened letters, unopened invitations to openings. So you have all of these kind of ironies within the time capsules, which are now in Pittsburgh at the Warhol Museum and Archive. And Richard will talk a little bit more about where these contact sheets fit in relationship to Warhol's practice as a photographer. And overall, what we have come to is a really exciting prospect of thinking through what new categories we need as scholars to bring to bear on this archive. So if those are some of the motivations of Stanford, we have to also ask what were the motivations of the Andy Warhol Foundation. And one of the things that was crucial to them in selecting Stanford was our promise to make a public presentation of the contact sheets, that we have agreed contractually that we will do some kind of exhibition of this work. Additionally, it's a gift, but it's a gift that keeps on taking, by which I mean that the cost of maintaining, digitizing, and making much of the archive is significant. So I think one of the reasons why Stanford was selected was that it has a large endowment and the sense that Stanford isn't going anywhere, all things being equal, was also a big part of why Andy Warhol Foundation wanted the archive here. And finally, I think the other thing that the contact sheets represent is a very interesting framing of the relationship between the document and the art object. And the document is usually seen as secondary to the art object. And therefore, there's a kind of assumption that it belongs to the realm of teaching rather than to the realm of exhibition. Or at least that had been the case for a long time. So one of the things that interests us about the archive as an occasion is what it does to the notion of time. What is the notion of time within the archive? And what we want to do is think through categories of art history and put them in dialogue with categories of performance studies. So does it make sense, for example, to talk about the contact sheets as rehearsals for the major work? So in many of these sheets, you'll see, and Richard's going to show you some, you'll see a big red circle. And many of these images were then turned into silk screens and are part of the overall well-known work of Warhol. So if we think of them as rehearsals, what does that tell us about the preparatory study? And how does Warhol's preparation for the making of an image differ from, say, Mark Rothko? And during the Q&A, we can go back to some of these things because I think they're quite interesting. The other thing that I think the contact sheets allow us to do is to look at some of Warhol's iconic work, including his work that is part of a series called Death and Disasters, that he began to make in the 60s. And one of the things you will notice about this is the word silence, which is in the back corner, is a very interesting enunciation in an image. His source material here is a photograph of the electric chair in Sing Sing prison. And it was in the news because Sing Sing was going to retire the electric chair. And Death and Disasters, in my view, that series is probably, for me, the most profound of all of Warhol's work. So if you think about this in terms of a source image and somebody who is creating data as much as he's creating art, I think you get to see a different way of thinking about Warhol as a social commentator. And I think that is going to be a big consequence of this work. And then thinking about the notion of what was the practice of taking these photographs and what result did they make in the world. So if we think his practice was to wear the camera everywhere and just to kind of click continuously. In many ways, he's quite prescient in relation to smartphones and Snapchat and these kinds of practices of endless re-photographing. But yet, so these things, they have the first temporality is a quick, largely unfocused shot. And then a second look in which he's scanning through contact sheets with 36 images, circling very few, but the few that he circulates then are made into something else. But the majority of them slumber. They are discarded, they're put to the side. And it's only relatively late in Warhol's life that the notion that these should be preserved comes to bear on them. And they have been essentially unexamined for about 30 years. And so now we have the pressure of our own time informing how we see them. So these multi-layers of time actually tell us quite a lot about photography as a practice and quite a lot about how time actually works. And then the other thing that happens, which is much larger than the story of Warhol, is the way in which exhibitions, museums are increasingly turning to documents and putting them on display. And so in one sense you could say the appetite to see has just grown ever more rapacious. But it's interesting in terms of what we count now as something worthy of artistic contemplation, worthy of display in a museum. And what I wanted to just end with now is just to talk very briefly here, to be just suggestive about the other performance of looking that the contact sheet asks us to enact. Because on the one hand, you're looking at them as a sheet, right? So you're looking at them one after another. And this is also one of the modes that Warhol tried to show in his actual museum work. So this is also from Death and Disasters. But it's the same image repeated. And what you begin to do when you look at them long enough is you get very interested in the square, in the lines between each image. And so too with the contact sheet. When you start looking at, are these whole objects or are these objects of 36 discrete images? What is the relationship between the fractional view and the entire view? And how does that also inform what Warhol was trying to do to his own viewer in the main work? Okay, so here, the other thing that happens on many of the contact sheets, there will be a blank space. And I think that that practice of looking at all of these contact sheets also informs the artistic work in this sense. It's been difficult to understand why Warhol would have blanks in the main silkscreens. And this is Liz Taylor in National Velvet. Okay, thank you so much.
Peggy suggested, one of our just biggest challenges in the beginning was trying to figure out, well, what do we do with these context sheets? And one of the most obvious, so this is a print, not a context sheet, that Warhol actually made very shortly before he died in 1986. And so one of the things, the context sheets we were told represent every photograph Warhol ever took from the mid-1970s till his death in 1987. So presumably that means that any print one is interested in, wherever you encounter it, and he had 2 books of photography, the first called Exposures, the second called America. Many of the photographs were printed, not many, but selected photographs were printed in the magazine Interview, and others appear, sometimes they now appear on the market, but generally they were not made to be exhibited in galleries, these prints. They were made to be reproduced again. This is a photograph of, for some reason, we only have it identified as a Kennedy and Grace Jones. If anyone recognizes which Kennedy, I think it's like a cousin. It's not, you know, like John or something. Or we would recognize him. But so, you know, as an example, we thought, okay, let's, so this is the image that you're seeing. Is it? Yes. Oh, fuck. Sorry. I can't really see. But this is the image, and actually you see that Warhol sometimes circled, but he also, if it was Warhol, we're not sure that it was always Warhol. This is another whole issue. Warhol appears also in some of these images, so clearly he wasn't always holding the camera. These are a whole set of methodological issues that Peggy and I are confronting, which we could talk about in the Q&A if you'd like. But what I want you to see here is just the obvious fact, and it may not seem even worthy of note, but when you're dealing with thousands of context sheets, you begin, you know, you have to, I mean, they're not all in the same orientation, because of course you're moving the camera around. Sometimes you're taking vertical shots, sometimes you're taking horizontal shots. And then you also have, of course, different moments, not just different moments, each one is a different moment, but different days, even different weeks, sometimes jumps of months. So although Warhol said, I take the camera with me so that I know where I was every minute, and I had expected that when we saw the context sheets, there would actually be kind of a documentation of every minute. There are huge temporal gaps. It so happens that this entire context sheet is not a good example of that, because it's all from one occasion, which is the wedding of Maria Shriver to Arnold Schwarzenegger in 1986. But what's interesting is that if you follow the logic, now this is the print Warhol shows. That's Grace Jones looking off to the side, and a Kennedy, dressed very Kennedy-like, a young Kennedy doing something, which we can't tell. When you look at the larger context sheet, and I'll show you a detail of it here, actually what you realize the story is that Warhol is interested in is that Kennedy has something wrong with his contact lens, and Grace Jones is trying to help him get the lens either in or out of his eye. So Grace Jones is actually performing this kind of surgery on the Kennedy, or you know, and what's interesting is that Warhol, can you still hear me? Yes. That Warhol doesn't actually print any of those photographs. I think here, the Kennedy, the one, is taking an ice cube from this, and like as the beginning of the procedure, you know, although he's smiling, which doesn't seem like he's in distress. But in any event, so it's typical, here's the wedding, and it's typical, you see Grace Jones, at least on this context sheet, you never see Arnold Schwarzenegger or Maria Shriver, even though they're also figures that Warhol would be of interest. This is useful not only because the whole series is in a way about looking and about this kind of literally this distress of the eye or this problem with looking, but also, and maybe more importantly for our Peggy and I purposes, Warhol looks away from what should be the central point of interest, which of course at a wedding is the bride and groom, knowing that it's the Kennedy wedding. There's going to be thousands of photographs of Arnold Schwarzenegger and Maria Shriver, you know, under the whatever, you know, I think that somewhere back there, maybe they're getting married. But he's interested in this sort of drama that's not really even a drama that would be worth, except if you're Warhol and you really are invested in the smallest sort of, unit of everyday life. That, you know, so like someone helping someone else, although with their contact lens. Warhol also is interested in the fact that the someone is Grace Jones, this huge star, disco star, or music star, and also denizen of Studio 54 and gay icon of the 70s and into the 80s, and also that the other one is a Kennedy boy that she is ministering to. Okay, so that's one kind of fun thing that we can do with the contact sheets, like find the original contact sheet and then put together a story that the photograph that actually had some moment in history, which is this one, even though we don't know if it was ever printed, it was printed as a print, but whether it was ever reproduced or seen by anyone other than Warhol and other people in his immediate surround, that we don't know. Whether it was even seen ever by Grace Jones or the Kennedy, we don't know. But nevertheless, we can now, and this is part of how these have been bequeathed to us as history, as a history of our present moment, is that we now have a view that no one but Warhol even had, and our view is different because we also have the knowledge of what now retroactively, what circulated in the world. Warhol, or whoever, or sometimes it was with his friend Christopher Makos, they had their own reasons for choosing what they chose, but we can't always know those reasons. But now Peggy and I and others who look at this can sort of put together narratives that have to do with our sort of speculative understanding of Warhol across the decades since the photographs were taken, including the photographs that, as Peggy said, have been slumbering. I mean, they're not even photographs yet. They're frames on a contact sheet, I mean, which is a photographic process, but they're not prints. But nevertheless, they've been slumbering, and we have the permission to make anything we want. We can make prints from any of the contact sheets. We can do blow-ups. In other words, the foundation has, we are not confined to making prints only of the photographs that Warhol made prints of, which means we can literally bring into public history Warhols that were never Warhols in their own moment, in terms of anybody outside of Warhol himself and perhaps a few other people. Okay, so the photograph I really wanted to focus on for the next five to 8 minutes is this photograph, which was not only printed by Warhol, but reproduced in his book Exposures, which is very important because there are only 2 books, and he worked with Bob Codlicello on this book. And we don't know whether he went through all of the contact sheets or whether he went through the prints that were already made. In other words, that had already been chosen, or if they went through to find ones for Exposures. But in either event, this one, which is a woman named Mrs. Gilbert Miller, who was the partial owner of the painting you see above her, which is Goya's Red Boy, one of the most famous paintings in the history of Western art, which now hangs at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And what is incredible, this is at a New Year's Eve party, so Mrs. Gilbert Miller, her father, she was married to a very important Broadway producer, Gilbert Miller. And anyway, I'm saying Mrs. Gilbert Miller because that's how she's identified by Warhol. So that's why I'm not giving her own name, which I'm also now forgetting, which is terrible, but it's because Warhol made her into Mrs. Gilbert Miller. But she is seated below the Red Boy. This is a photograph by Billy Baldwin, her interior decorator, of how he basically designed this entirely yellow room, or almost entirely yellow, as a counter, so that the red would pop, even more than Goya perhaps even intended. But I'm also showing you, although this photograph was not published till the 70s, this design had been in place since the 50s, and she never changed it. So you can see it's like the same couch. And because Billy Baldwin wanted you to see his original design from the 50s, and the reason I'm saying that is this photograph and other photographs that I will show, Mrs. Gilbert Miller and Gilbert Miller, her husband, they had these incredibly lavish and sort of famously Luke's New Year's Eve parties in the 1950s with various sort of celebrities like Elsa Maxwell. And then Billy Baldwin did, he would do special treatment of the drapes. Can you still hear me? Yeah. I just like to move. Anyway, like you see, I can't even remember what that garland is. But in any event, it's like you see this picture, like the Billy Baldwin picture of the interior, is meant, although it's capturing in this case the 1957, I think, New Year's Eve party, it's also meant to be a kind of timeless image of the melding, of the sort of sophistication of the modern home, I mean of the modern social world, and of the Millers with the canonical, like the beauty and the elevated status. I mean, the most elevated status within the history of Western art of this work of art. Interestingly, in terms of time, just as a side note, her father, who had this very extensive collection of old masters, he said to her, when I die, I'm giving it all to the Met, but you can choose one painting to have for part of the year, and then the other part it'll be at the Met. And so she chose the Red Boy, and she always chose to have it at least in the part of the year where New Year's Eve was, so that she could, like have all these people come and see that she had the Red Boy. And my fantasy is that she never told them that it was going away. But I mean, they could just go to the Met and see it. But the other thing is that when they got the painting, they put, Mrs. and the Millers put out an engraved invitation to all their friends saying, please come to our apartment on Fifth Avenue and meet Don Osorio, I'm forgetting the little boy's name, which is some incredibly Spanish name. So people thought it was a new diplomat in town or someone from the UN, and then they came to meet the boy, which is an interesting thing in terms of Warhol, because what he said about the painting in his diaries, he said, I went to, he called her the old bag, which was not particularly, but he was actually interested in these he didn't call her the old bag, he said he liked to go to the parties of these old bags because of hearing the history, hearing their stories. I mean, it's not Warhol was not a particularly kind person, but anyway, that's a different story. But he also wanted to go to see the Red Boy, but what's amazing to me about this photograph and why I'm comparing it to these is the defacement of the image by the moment, which is to say the flash. It's not even clear to me in this environment, I don't know, but that Warhol would have needed a flash for this photograph. But whether he needed, because he often used flash, but often he didn't. Obviously with those pictures from the Kennedy wedding, it's outside. Anyway, I don't know whether flash would have been needed, but certainly even if you needed flash, there would be ways to do it so that the flash was not obscuring, the Red Boy. So if the point is to ponder the Red Boy, then this would seem to be a failed photograph. What Warhol said, though, and you'll notice that in all of these photographs of the Red Boy, no one is looking at the painting. Warhol is looking at the painting, but he's also clearly looking at Mrs. Gilbert Miller and at this other woman, neither of whom are looking at each other. And Mrs. Gilbert Miller, this is, shall we say, not her in her, it's neither her in her prime nor the apartment in its prime. So almost all of the other art has been sold off. Her husband has been, she's certainly not fallen on hard times, but by the standards of her previous life, things have gotten a little bit, frayed around the edges. And if you just notice that the painting is slightly askew, I mean, the painting isn't askew, but the perspective at which Warhol takes it, and you don't even get the entire painting. So there is this way in which Warhol, I would say, is disturbing the art historical logic of looking at a painting, or even the sophisticates, at least belief that, okay, for a moment I have to admire this thing and pretend, that I care about the Goya or the Red Boy. And so here's what Warhol said, and then I'm going to finish so that we can have a conversation. He says, and after dinner, so this is at one of these New Year's Eve parties, he says, and after dinner I sat underneath Goya's Red Boy. Again, he says, I sat underneath it. He doesn't say anything about what he thought of the painting, other than Kitty has it, has this most famous painting right there in her house. It's unbelievable. Again, that she has this most famous painting, not this most beautiful, this most important. Kitty's parties used to be the biggest thing in New York, with every Hollywood star there, and now it's just down to her friends. Amy Melly, Susie, who was an important gossip society and gossip columnist, didn't even RSVP this year. So not only did she not go, she didn't even bother to RSVP. Diane de Beauvoir took my hand and we ran into the next room right as midnight was coming on. I sort of wanted to stay and kiss the old bags like I did the year before, because actually it was so much fun to do. Kiss 90-year-old Elsie Woodard and say, Happy New Year, darling. Then Minnie de Beauvoir came. Okay, then it goes on, and then he says, he says, at the food at Kitty's, it was the canned, frozen stuff again. The first thing you think. Well, at first you think maybe these rich people don't know any better because they're going to charity dinners all their lives. But they do go to La Grenouille too, and that's really good food. So they must notice the difference. And there were 6 servants serving the canned food. And of course this idea of canned food, going back to this Campbell soup, is just really fascinating, although by this point in Warhol's life, he's expecting La Grenouille, not Campbell soup. And just to finish, so finally, of course, just in terms of Peggy and mine methodology, which as you heard is different, but now we're trying to figure out a way, which I think we are concocting or devising, to actually do something that is neither quite art historical nor quite performance studies, but a kind of conversation between the two and between these, well, not these objects, but the strange and, now I think very intriguing objects that are the contact sheets, in large part through conversations with Peggy, but also through looking at them more closely and realizing that some of their lack of visual interest, like for example, the Kennedy boy having his seemingly lack of visual interest, having his contact lens attended to by Grace Jones, that would have been interesting to me. But anyway, something like that, the lack of visual interest is their interest. That is Warhol's refusal to compose according to the rules of aesthetic fine photography. That's not what his interest in the camera was. That it's capturing moments, for example, not people in their prime, but people when they're serving canned food to their New Year's Eve guests because they're no longer, the glamorous smart set that they were in the 50s. So the last thing to say is that, of course, I said there's an archivist named Amy De Pasquale who's brilliant at helping us to find things because this is this overwhelming archive, and she has been digitizing and researching each contact sheet, and as she does so, she shares with us when we ask, like I said, can you find Mrs. Gilbert Miller and the Red Boy? And she looked through everything and she couldn't find it. The closest she could get, I didn't even say, so you're missing the cats. The cats have been obliterated, and the magpie, which is holding Goya's calling card. So this whole thing, in a very Warholian way, is a promotional ad for Goya. But anyway, here. So there is no contact sheet that we have of the Red Boy with Mrs. Gilbert Miller seated, looking somewhat despondent, and that other woman who knows who she is, in the archive, which means that the promise, first of the Warhol Foundation and then of Stanford's press release, that said that this archive represents every photographic work, and they called it a work for some reason, every photograph that Warhol took, is not true. Bob Colacello has taken some of the contact sheets that he said he was the photographer for. Others are clearly missing, or maybe they're in the time capsules. And I actually meant to ask the archivist, well, what happens when one of them turns up? Do we get it? Probably not. I'm sure contractually, the archive we got is what we own. But anyway, what the archivist did find, which I thought was really interesting, was a different party, I think a different party, also probably a New Year's Eve party, with this very close friend of Warhol's named Victor Hugo, who was kind of a gay clone, like a muscular, hairy mustache, very, very desirable man, especially by the standards of gay culture in the 1970s. And Warhol complained that whenever he went out with him, even though Warhol was famous, all the boys, all the men would, want to talk to Victor Hugo. But anyway, there's Victor Hugo wearing this odd on him in terms of his usual outfits, Spanish, I guess, sort of hat, and he is standing, he's posing beneath the Red Boy. I believe, although I haven't been able to totally confirm this, that this is Mrs. Gilbert Miller, and that this is Mrs. Gilbert Miller. And again, you can see that the house and the surrounds and even what people are wearing, it's by no means, time has definitely, at time and history and age, all have elapsed, and capital, to some extent, has diminished. But what's also interesting to me is here, it says the Warhol's world, Victor Hugo, Studio 54, the world even of gay, a sort of gay culture or gay secrets or gay eroticism is infiltrating the space the uptown, once very rarefied, or at least kind of very different social world of Mrs. Gilbert Miller, as she seems to be somewhat receding from the scene. So I wanted to end, and actually this is so this is part of the context sheet. There's a completely overexposed image. You can see many overexposed images, so it's not just that you're piecing together minute by minute what happened, because sometimes the minute is illegible. It's a blank, it's a blank space, it's a void. And if you think of one's own like memory or even life, like how many minutes have we spent that are either gone, or if it didn't even feel like they were there to begin with, like just a minute, whatever, a minute of waiting in line, or a minute, like this minute in Mrs. Gilbert Miller's life could have been one of those minutes that were gone for, like, I'm sitting on this couch, what the hell, like here's this guy taking this, like no one's talking to me, it's my party, I didn't mean to go forward, but anyway, that's where I kind of wanted to end in order to maybe to bring Peggy back to the stage, but also to open this up now because we've raised lots of questions. But I think, I just moved us a little closer to who I think is Mrs. Gilbert Miller. There is someone still wearing a tux at the party, so that's nice. But anyway, also so that you could see, and you'll notice that none of these frames were chosen by Warhol to be printed. So again, I think part of the fascination of Peggy and I, our conversation together, our grappling with these images, is this gap between us now, like for example, this is our first public display of these images. Now we are making a new moment of possibility for, as Peggy said, these images that have been slumbering for 30 years. Okay, so we're gonna move over here. Thank you.
So as Richard and I were trying to find a way to work together, we decided we would borrow Warhol's method. So we sat together and talked into a tape recorder, because at the same time that he got this camera, he also got a tape recorder. And he would say, this is the way to get rid of all your problems. Just talk into the tape recorder and never listen to it. So,
and he also said that the tape recorder was his wife.
Yes. So we talked into the tape recorder.
So I don't know what that means about talking but never listening to your wife.
And then we had somebody transcribed our conversations. And Warhol has a novel called A, which is a transcript of a day in the life of Odin. And we now have this text that I haven't read. Have you read it?
I mean, I said I read it.
Did you read it?
I glanced. I read parts of it. I think parts of it are good.
Parts
of it are like, it's like the context sheets.
Yes,
I mean, parts
are good and parts are bad. But the process of doing it really did allow me to see that, yes, there is this problem of the flatness of the image that we will have to address in the exhibition. And I think it allowed Richard to see some of the things that he was saying. So what we're trying to say is that the archive has already performed in our expanding understanding of what we can and what we can't actually do with this work for an exhibition and for public presentation, and of which this is the first.
Yeah, and I would just add, and so then I'm going to hope there are questions, because actually just this experience, Peggy said things that she's never said. I heard things that she's never said on our taped conversations. And I think actually when academics, or anyone for that matter, has to get up and give a presentation, even if it wasn't written out, you end up formulating thoughts for an audience that you might not formulate for a friend and coworker or for yourself. And that's also part of our idea, is that by collaborating, not just as the two of us, but also as our training. I mean, even if you think about, for example, like what I presented, which is not to say Peggy wouldn't also go deeply into individual images, but that's what I've been trained to do, is like find the source image, compare things. And I think Peggy's presentation, it was asking, in a way, I think, much more profound, well, I don't want to say profound, much different questions, not because they weren't profound, but that makes my thing not profound. But anyway, very, more, I think more philosophical or more broadly, I don't know, kind of existential even questions about time and and the time of one's life, and the time of history, and then the time of art, and the time of photography, among other things. And I think that, for example, interest in temporality and the photograph as document rather than the photograph as art comes out of Peggy's performance studies background, in large part.
But we'd love to have your comments. Yes, in the middle, the brown sweater, yes.
I was wondering on the area of intentionality of art, is it clear Warhol understood how the aperture would control flatness? I mean, was he like a really good technical photographer, or he
No, I mean, I think you could tell, which isn't to say, let me put it differently. I think that there are photographs toward the end of his life. He actually had these stitched photographs made, which were done for an exhibition, where he took 4 prints of the same photograph and had them sewn together. So you actually see the stitch work. So it's this very kind of paradoxical thing of the photograph as like a, mechanically reproduced image through this machine, and then this craft of stitching, which I think maybe it was sewn with a machine, but even so,
yes, it was
okay.
with a machine.
But not by Warhol. But
yeah.
and those are really strong. I think for the most part, those are compositionally and aesthetically strong images. And I'm not saying that he wasn't capable of making such images. And he did have different cameras, and there might have been, but there might have been various degrees of technical, I'm sure, over the years. However, that wasn't his ambition in his day-to-day photographing, as you can see. So that if he had been more attentive to the technical aspects, which he may or may not have known, it's a good question, he wouldn't have had all those overexposed images or those blanks. And what I think in a way, and this is one of the lessons of hearing Peggy speak today, I'd never thought about the blanks in the paintings, in the silkscreen paintings in relation, but Warhol's interested, part of his aesthetic is in the image that falters, or the image that never even makes it into visibility, that is to say, the blank, in relation to the image that succeeds. And so even those images of Elizabeth Taylor or Marilyn, some of them are quite visible and iconic, but others, it looks like they've been half erased or partially rubbed out. They flicker somewhere between reality and memory, as it were. And I think that in a way, I think Warhol, when he says, the camera tells me where I was every minute, it's more important to him to click the shutter release and to have a relation to that minute, even if he never looks at the image again, beyond seeing it on the contact sheet and rejecting it, than I think it is to make an aesthetically achieved or accomplished composition.
So Andy Warhol made paintings, movies, photographs, he wrote a book. First, my question is, do you think that all this is somehow has common in his, what he did, it's something you can formulate a single kind of thing that was just shown in different types of art? And secondly, do you think that his importance in general in arts could become compared, for example, to Picasso?
Okay, did everybody hear the question? The microphone was going in and out. Okay, so the question is, given the extensive nature of Warhol's production, does it make sense to try to say Warhol's project was X, Y, or Z? And I think that, for me, the answer is yes to that question, because I think at the end of the day, Warhol's production, as prodigious as it was inspired by a certain kind of notion about what human life is and what we owe each other. And most people don't talk about Warhol in relationship to ethics or obligation, but I think there is a really interesting way to read Warhol in regard to these questions of what do we owe each other. So, for example, the Death and Disaster series that I showed, there's a series of photographs that I've written about which Warhol purchased rejected suicide photographs from newspapers and tabloids. Newspapers and tabloids would buy these images, but then often something would actually happen and they would not be able to make it into the final edition, into print. So Warhol would buy them, and he collected them. And so that raises all sorts of questions. What is the status of a rejected suicide photo? Like, that's pretty mind-boggling already. And then what does it mean to hold them, to keep them, to include them in your own legacy to the museum called the Andy Warhol Museum. So these kinds of questions about witnessing and standing in for in a kind of neutral way are, I think, part of Warhol's main, the main, how would I put it? I think that that aspect of Warhol's production is singular to Warhol, and that it can be a way of understanding all of the work that he was doing. It's one way, it's not the only way. The second question is a question, how do you think about Warhol in relationship to an artist such as Picasso? And I have something to say about it, but maybe I'll let Richard
Well, I think part of Warhol's achievement is that you can't really, I mean, the logic of his work is incommensurate with the kind of logic of modernism that came before, not just with Picasso, but with someone like closer in time like Jackson Pollock, although Picasso was still alive too. And what I would say is, Warhol was once asked, well, for you, what makes a painting successful? And the person really meant like, aesthetically. And he said, a painting that sells. That's what meant, and actually, although it's funny, I think that Warhol's relationship to the market has had his embrace, absolutely unembarrassed, embrace of the market has had enormous effects on contemporary artists today. If you look at Jeff Koons or Damien Hirst or Murakami, there is no longer this shame about feeling that capital or profiteering is dirty or is beneath the artist, or that the artist needs to be suffering during his or her lifetime. And so I think that Warhol's achievement, Warhol is certainly the most famous artist of the 20th century, and the prices his work commands, if we go by his own, which I wouldn't myself adopt as an art historian as the only or as the most important marker. But I think that what's interesting, and this is what I also realized about the context sheets, if we bring a traditional or even a modernist, so not a Renaissance, but let's say a modernist, like Picasso, let's say, perspective, we're just not going to understand the logic that Warhol is proposing. We're also not going to understand, like, one of the questions I have is, like, why does he remain so incredibly popular? Why is his work so highly, in other words, with Picasso, I feel like I can answer that question differently with earlier artists, like with Goya, but with Warhol, I find it more difficult, but that's a different question. Another thought?
There seems to be a degree of similarity in some of the pictures that you've shown to the New York street photographer Ouija.
Yes.
Would you care to comment on that?
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that. I did a show actually of Ouija's Los Angeles photography, which is very much lesser known, called Naked Hollywood, which was the name of his book. But in any event, yes, and Warhol was a fan of Ouija's. They actually met. Warhol writes about Ouija in his diaries. There are photographs of the two of them together, very much at the end of Ouija's career. But I do think there is a relation, although Ouija, in the beginning of his career, and actually throughout, he also is making photographs to sell, but they need to sell in the beginning to newspapers. And you can't sell something that's overexposed. I mean, that is to say, Ouija was much, much more careful and much more interested in the composition, because it had to be one that, as he said, would have punch, and so I think that Warhol's interest in Ouija is more along the lines of the low and of death and disaster and of our fascination with other people's misfortune, and with the aesthetic, but not as an aesthetic that Warhol himself took up. These photographs do not have the drama, almost never do they have the drama of a Ouija. So if Ouija he wouldn't have been photographing a wedding, but let's say he were, I mean, you'd get photographs of the bride and groom, but then Ouija would go behind their backs and take photographs, and he would also, one thing that they shared, I mean, when Ouija took photographs of a murder, he also took photographs of the looks on the people's faces as they were seeing the body. Ouija and Warhol shared a fascination with spectatorship and with the emotion of the audience, rather than only focusing on the spectacle.
Yeah, and that brings us also back to the death and disaster, the electric chair with the word silence, which is also an acknowledgement of the spectator and the quietism of the spectator in relation to the electric chair. So again, in terms of Warhol as a data collector, also as a social commentator, I think the contact sheets tell us quite a lot about that aspect of his work. I think this gentleman had it's all been men. Any women want to say anything?
Let me get the last mail question in then. You referenced the question of which exposures were by Warhol, which red X's were by him. I mean, we're all used to the idea that Shakespeare had collaborators. Jeff Koons probably has more employees than Microsoft. What's at stake for you, or what does it matter? What's, quote, Warhol and what's the machine?
That's a great question. I think it matters a little. I don't think it's absolutely determining, because I think this archive is the Warhol archive. But part of what Warhol puts in question is who made the work. And he said early on, you know, anyone can make my work, and so on and so forth. So we already know that there are multiple authors of a Warhol. And Carolyn Jones wrote a very good book in which she talked about the Warhol effect rather than Warhol as Warhol. But to me, I think it does matter that it is Warhol who is blotting out the bottom of the Goya. That, you know, you could raise lots of questions. Is it just, quote unquote, a bad photograph with the flash not really positively anticipated? Or is it a kind of rivalry? You know, like, I'm going to kill all the animals in this image. You know, it's very interesting what he actually removes, or what he makes it hard to see, which would be a better way of saying it. Because you can see that there's something there, but you're not seeing it. And for me, it's this double gesture of showing and withholding that I think is really interesting, and particularly for an artist who is so prodigious and seems to be always showing us things. He's also showing us what he's not showing us. So for me, it matters. But
I think just a one sentence or two sentence response, which is, you know, when Peggy showed that image of Warhol with the camera and started talking about in the way in which it's almost a new kind of camera person, you know, body that includes the camera, I'm thinking about the idea that I think what mattered to Warhol was the introduction of the camera into the social space, whoever was clicking the shutter release. So when he says, I want to be a camera, it says the Warhol's camera is Warhol. I mean, both on the, for the purposes of the archive and how it's valued, but also, in a sense, the effect of the overall project.
yeah.
I'm afraid that's all the time we have today. Thank you so much for attending.